Welcome to my step-by-step guide on how to make a kitchen knife in the classroom setting. Over the next 7 chapters, I will show you how to take these raw materials and make your own kitchen knife model. This video is intended for students to use in a classroom setting, but may be used by other people as an introductory on how to make your own simple kitchen knife. I'd like to start with some safety first, and all students should be wearing glasses, ear protection, and gloves. When using the angle grinders, you must also use a full face shield. Okay, first step. You can choose your shape from the template and trace it onto the steel. The steel we are using is 1080 high carbon steel from Nordic Edge. It's 38 millimeters high and 3.5 millimeters thick. I'm going to choose this chef knife template, and we're just going to line up as close to the end and as close to that top straight edge as we can. Traced shape here. The next step is to take this steel down to the texture mark. We will cut off Throughout this project, we want to be focusing on quality. We want to be thinking about the knife as a final product on its own. We want to limit production marks. So holding it in a vise, dropping it, hitting it with a hammer, that sort of thing. We want to try and avoid that. When we clamp this steel in the vise to cut the excess away, we want to avoid clamping parts that won't be filed and creating indents. So you can imagine that the bevel of this knife is going to come up somewhere here. This will be the stock that we remove to get our shape. So we don't want to clamp on there. We can clamp in the vise on the handle, and imagine that's roughly where the handle might go. We can clamp this area and we can clamp here, but we want to avoid that part. When cutting the steel, we want to put the steel in the vise as close to where we're cutting as possible to avoid flex while we're cutting. We always use the vise. We always try and cut down when we can. We don't want to throw sparks across the rest of the classroom into other students. It might take multiple cuts to get some of these curves, so you just have to be patient. Trying to cut as close as we can to the texture marks without going over. You need to take your time. If we go over into the blank, we end up having to make the blank smaller or filling marks with resin when we put the handles on, which limits your choice of material. We're just working our way nice and close to this. We don't have to do the vise up very tight, just firm enough to hold it so it doesn't move. You don't need to squash the steel. So always trying to cut downwards. We don't want to cut across or up. We have 2 hands on the angle grinder. So we're using a thin blade here, which means that when you're cutting the steel, you can't twist within the steel or you will break the blade. You have to do straight cuts and remove. Also, we start the machine up and then introduce it into the material. We never start the machine on the material. That's a tricky bit in there around the front of that handle. Just need to take your time. At this stage, if your texture marks have come off, you can retrace again. I'm going to take this excess off now using a couple of different tools. We can use the handheld angle grinder with the grinding blade. It's not quite as accurate, but it's good to get excess stock off. So the grinding blade's the thick one with the mushroom profile. Make sure that when you put this blade on, the collet has the flat side up, as opposed to the thin blade, where the collet has the raised side up. So they need to be installed that way for those blades. So you can shape with that blade. I don't recommend it. I would much prefer to use the bench grinder. So we'll go over here and do that. So with the bench grinder, we're using long sweeping motions and we're trying to remove the texture mark. We're going to take it down to the texture and then just past the texture so that we've got the profile of our timber template. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that shape now. Managed to cut the raw steel down to that outline and we don't have any flaws, any production marks on the blade yet. Now we need to smooth these edges down and we can start with the Radius Master grinder. Some of these parts here we can't get into with that grinder and we can't smooth it with the bench grinder either. We can use a spindle sander. So all around our blank is nice and smooth now, ready for sanding. Just going to take a pass across here so we can draw our midline on. Okay, so we have our blank. The next stage is to remove the production marks from the grinding from the last stage. We're going to do this by hand sanding. We're going to use our Stanley vise, and we're going to make sure that we have our plastic jaw covers in place so that we don't score or mark the metal. I'm going to clamp this in here. We're going to work our way through the sandpaper grits starting at 120. We double this over and we use a stick to sand against. The doubling gives us a little bit of padding, a bit of a buffer, and the stick makes sure that we've not lost any sanding energy as opposed to just trying to do it by hand. So we're sanding with 120 until we see all of the production marks gone, and we're moving the sandpaper around until we've used up all of the sections of the sandpaper. If you've ground your knife smoothly on the radius master, you shouldn't have a lot of this sanding to do. But if you have production marks or wonky grind marks, you might need to go back to that grinder and just take them out and then come back to this stage. When you're happy with the sanding from the 120, you can move up to the 240. Now, if you sand with the 240 and you find that there's some deeper marks that won't come out, you can just go back to the 120. It's a process. It's not always linear. It's a little bit hard to tell on the video, but we're aiming for very smooth. Once the 240 marks are out, you can step up to 320. You can see here, so the higher the number, the finer the grit. Now we will take our edges up to 600 or 800. I've got some 800 here. 600 is fine. So we're just assessing. If we see some marks we don't like, we go back down a few grits, try and take them out. So just thinking about that final knife, an extra 5 minutes, when you hand it over to someone for a look, and their eyes aren't drawn to any flaws or scratches that you've missed. When you'll want to use this for the rest of your life, you don't regret not taking a few extra minutes. Okay, so the back's done. We don't have to do the base of the blade because that's going to be filed down, sanded down, but we need to do the rest of the handle. To get into the curves, you can wrap some sandpaper around a file or a small piece of dowel, up to you, but it's the same process as before. Working our way through the grits to clean up any production marks from them. Okay, so this is a good stage to just check your work, ask your friends, get them to look for any flaws, and just spend that extra little bit of time making sure that everything's good. That looks fine, ready to go. So, the next step is drilling some pinholes and some mounting holes. We can imagine that our handle is going to go somewhere like that. I'd like to find the center now between the handle and the end. Looking at about 125 length from the back to the handle. So we will go 62.5 roughly the center. Then you can eyeball where you would like the pins to be. We're going to make 3 pinholes. So that one's 50 mils from there. We'll put this one in the same spot, 50 mils in, so they look evenly spaced. And then I just like to check that they're in the center height-wise. 21, that's pretty good. This one looks like it needs to go down a bit. 30, come down to 15. Just a bit lower. And this one here, slightly lower as well. Once you're happy with your pin holes, you need to center punch them so when you drill they don't move. One sharp tap. So these will be our brass pin holes. We need some mounting holes now for the filing jig. So just in between these holes, we're just going to put 2 4mm holes. One sharp tap. These are for the screws to go through to hold the jig. I'm just going to use a 4mm drill bit for this. The pin holes are 1/8 inch holes. We might as well drill them right now. We're going to deburr those holes. Once the holes are drilled, we're going to mark the center line of our blade with a texter so that we know how far to take our bevels down. So black. We know that our material is 3.5 mils thick, so we want to find the center line, and we can do that with the caliper. So we will set the caliper at 1.75 or thereabouts. Lock it in. And just using it as a guide, scratch it along the center line. The caliper material is quite hard, and the knife material is quite soft, so it will scratch along nicely. It'll be hard to see on the video, but you'll get a center line, and this will help us with our filing in the next stage. For this next section, you're going to need a filing jig. We've just made our own here, and you can do the same if you like. The measurements for the timber are written on this jig. The eyelet that we use is a 6mm stainless eyelet, and we have a piece of leather wrapped around here to reduce the noise of this filing. The files are just standard number 1, number 2 cut files, but we have them mounted onto a piece of rod that's 1/2 inch or 13mm rod and mounted on with some zip ties. You can notch the files. You can see some notches here, and you can notch the rods to match if you like, and that stops them from moving around. I think this one's notched in here, and just notched up here to stop the rods from coming off. We have to mount this knife onto our filing jig, and what we're going to do is find roughly the center of the blade, at the back of the blade here. So, looking here, my blade is going to end up a bit under 180. So I'll just shift that along. And the center of this blade is going to be about here. It doesn't really matter, it's just giving us a reference point for when we flip the blade over. So as long as it's nice and close to the center, that's what we need. We're going to line up this center line with the line on our jig here, and we're going to have the heights of each of the end of the blade just at the same, roughly the same height, each one. You can measure that if you want. So that's about 10 millimeters. It's about 11. Bring it down just a little bit. So we'll drive through screws through the screw holes. Try not to move the knife too much. It's going to hold our knife in place while we're filing. We're also going to put a screw up the end just to counteract the motion of the filing. I've placed that screw just away from the blade so that when the head tucks down, that's the part that touches the blade. So we've got that as a stopper there. When we begin our filing, we don't want to file too far up the handle, so we're going to use a file stopper. We just use old worn out files that have gone blunt. We chop them off, round them up a little bit, and we put them where we want our blade to stop. So I'm going to try and make this blade bevel stop just past where the blade is going to finish. So we'll pop that on there, hard against there, and we'll just clamp that on. There we are. Now the height of the eyelet, this one's set up pretty high for a pretty sharp bevel. If you have a steep angle bevel, your knife will end up chopping and splitting more than actually cutting. So you can play around with this bevel what you want, but we're going to try and aim and get our bevel up around this bevel line that we've drawn here. So the correct motion for filing is file forward, lift up, bring the file back, and file again. The files do not work in reverse. There is no point dragging them. It just creates heat and it doesn't do anything. So we're going to push forward with our filing. Backhand is doing all of the power. Front hand is just very lightly steering it. So you can put a little bit of grease or WD-40 on this if the noise is annoying you. This bevel looks like it's going to be too steep. It's going to get to the center line way too quick. So I'm going to lower the eyelet down. Okay, I'm not going to continue filing this whole thing for this video. That'd be very boring. But you need to keep your file clean with a file brush to avoid deep scratches. If you get pieces of this metal jammed in the file and you're filing, you'll gouge out the metal, which means you have to keep filing, or when you're at the final stage, you'll have to do a lot more sanding. You want to work through to the midline that we've got here, change from a number 1 cut file to a number 2 cut file so that your sanding is not so hard. So this is a finer file, and you'll do your last stages of that filing with the finer file. Let's assume that our filing has come down to the center line of this blade edge. It's time to flip the knife over. Pretty easy. Clean this off. Take off our file stopper. We can mark that first so we know where to line it up on the other side. We'll take our file stopper off. We're going to undo our screws. We're going to flip our knife over. So it flips over that line that we drew at the start. And we had, from memory, we had roughly 10 or 11 mils at each end. So let's bring that one down a little bit. Okay. If it's a class jig, it's probably covered in holes. You might want to mark the ones that you were using, because you'll be flipping it backwards and forwards a little bit until you get this inside edge down to 0.7 of a millimeter. Okay, we're going to put our file stop back on. We can use the file itself as a bit of a guide, and we've got our lines that we drew on before. So I've lined that up with the texture mark and hard against that edge. I'm just going to clamp that down. Okay, now we can start filing. Put a light bit of marine grease on that. We don't want to get any grease on the files though. At this stage, you'll have used a number 1 file and a number 2 file to take your bevels down. You'll have flipped the knife over 3 or 4 times, maybe more, working your bevels down to the center line. There's no rushing this stage. It's just part of the process that takes a little while. Our aim is to get the center of our blade down to 0.7, 0.72, 0.68, 0.61. So around that 0.7. The reason that we want 0.7 is because it's much thinner and the blade will ribbon under the heat of the forge, and any thicker and it takes too much to sharpen. If you get to this stage and it's 0.8 in one section and 0.6 in another, and you're a bit worried you don't want to file anymore, you can pre-sharpen in the sharpening machine before you heat treat, and that will save you some time at that next stage. So at the end of this stage, we have our nice smooth profile around our blank, and we have our bevels filed down to 0.7 or thereabouts, and they're roughly the same height on each side. Don't get too carried away with this as long as they're close. Once we start sanding this with some 120, you won't see those transition lines anymore. Now we move on to sanding our knife blank prior to heat treat. We will move up through the grits of sandpaper until our knife is nice and smooth, and we do this at this stage because once it is heat treated, it is too hard to remove any major marks. Mounting your knife you need to make sure that the tip is mounted flush just back from the end of this timber, and that the blade you're sanding is close, the side you're sanding is close to the edge here. Mounting your blade on the timber for sanding is important for safety. We need to have the tip back from the end of the material so you don't stab yourself, and we need to have this edge here inside the border of the timber so that you don't cut yourself. It needs to be close to the edge of the material because when we use the stick, the bevel angle here is lower than the piece of timber. If you mount your knife in the center, you won't be able to sand the bevel without the stick hitting the piece of timber. At this stage, you can use screws through this timber if you like, but I find the clamps are just as good because you'll be flipping the blade over in between sanding. We're going to start with some 120. Same technique as when we profiled the outsides. Fold in half, bend over the stick and pinch. Instantly we can see the effects of the 120 sandpaper. They're taking off that first layer. We need to keep going with the 120 until these file lines are gone. This stage here is probably the most time consuming. Once we get the 120 down even, the next few grits are much quicker. When sanding, you're pushing quite hard with your stick. It's not a gentle process. You want to really put some pressure down in through the sandpaper to get the marks out. When checking for marks, if you then back that pressure off and lightly run the sandpaper up and down the blade, you'll see that the file marks stand out more. And you'll be able to assess how much more needs to be done. I'm still sanding with the 120 and I'm getting very close to being finished with this grit. I'm going to drag along lightly, and the blade parallel, and then check closely for any file marks. There's a small one just here, so I'll concentrate on that. There's absolutely no point moving on from 120 to 240 until all of your file marks or production marks are gone. The 240 will only remove marks from the 120. It won't do the job of removing marks from the file. Areas around here can be frustrating, and scratches in the middle of the blade can be frustrating as well. You can play around, reorientate your sandpaper, concentrate on those areas. It's one of those things where another 5 or 10 minutes on one section and your knife will be fantastic. You may come across some stubborn scratches and you can reorientate your sandpaper and work on them bits with a little bit more aggression. Be sure to sand the handle with 120 to remove this dark layer. This will help the glue stick when we put the handle on. I'm going to move on to the 240 now. With the 240 done, I'll begin now on 320. Just finished the 320, and if you've done your 120 and 240 correctly, the 320 stage doesn't take very long at all. We're going to move up to some 800 wet and dry. Now you can wet this a little bit just with some water, and that just helps to keep the surface cool and lubricate the sandpaper as you're using it. Okay, so that side is done. When I flip it over, I like to go to a clean side of the timber, just because some of the grit that is on the sanded side can scratch our nice clean blade. Okay, once the knife's sanded up to 600 or 800, we're ready for the next couple of steps. I like to draw where the handle's going to go and just come inside that boundary a little bit. We're just going to drill some indents to increase the surface area for the handle to stick onto. I'm using a 10mm bit. You can see here, just in a couple of mils. Depending how thick this edge is here, you might want to pre-sharpen. We use this Chef Choice sharpener. It's got 3 different courses of stones, and we're just going to pull this through the number 1 stone a few times. You can see that's put a very fine edge on there, and that will be just enough to make it easier to sharpen once this knife has been hardened. The next stage for our knife is the heat treating stage. If you're doing this at home, you need a forge and a quench tank. We use a very early model forge from Moosehead Forges. You can find them on Facebook. And we use a quench tank full of canola oil. This process involves using heat to heat the metal up until it's non-magnetic, and then it gets dunked into the oil. So we will evenly heat this knife in the forge. When it's non-magnetic, tested with a magnet, we will bring it out and we will dunk it into the oil for 3 seconds, then it will come out for 3 seconds, then it will go back in, and once it stops bubbling, we will let it drip, then we will clamp it between some pieces of aluminium in a vise we have made. First step is to preheat the oil. Our vise here is just a simple timber bench vise that we have converted with some 10mm pieces of aluminium. The aluminium sucks the heat out of the steel and makes sure that it's flat. Wipe all that excess oil off. Check if it's straight. Looks fantastic. And then a bit of 120. We'll knock some of this scale off. Once the blade's been sanded slightly, it goes into this pizza oven for the tempering cycles. So we're going to set this at 200 degrees on bake for 40 minutes. After the first 40 minutes, we'll let it completely cool, and then we'll do another cycle of 40 minutes. That releases the tension at a molecular level and means that the blade won't snap if bent or won't shatter if dropped. After 2 cycles in the oven to temper the steel, it should come out this beautiful bronze colour, or straw colour it's often referred to. If the knife is still a silvery colour, the temperature hasn't been high enough, or if it's turned bluey purple, the temperature has been too high. I suggest 200 as a starting point, but you'll need to play around with your own oven and mark the perfect point at which this straw colour occurs. At this stage, we have to remove the straw colour, sand the blade back. We can work our way through the grits. There might be some scale or some bubbling from the heat treatment process. We'll just work those little pieces out with some 120. Once the handle's been sanded all the way around and the knife is sanded to 800 grit, it's time to fit the handle. Before that, I'm going to clean out these black indents just with the drill bit. The next stage is fitting the handle. I've chosen these American white oak handle scales, but there is endless variety of handle scales you can choose from. Lots of our students have the choice of timber or micarta or G10 scales, all from Nordic Edge. So first thing we need to do is cut some pins that are about the thickness of the materials combined. You can go a little bit over if you like. You can cut these with a small angle grinder or a hacksaw, taking care not to bend them. Once we have the pins cut, we're going to rough them up. We're going to put them in the pedestal drill and use some 120 sandpaper to take the glaze off the pins and to allow them to slide through our pinholes a little easier. You can see the roughed up pin compared to the unsanded pin. That's what they all need to look like. Taking care to drill the pinholes is absolutely critical. This is a process that you need to follow carefully to avoid wasting the handle scales and to get a nice final fit and finish. We're going to use the pedestal drill to drill the first hole, and then we're putting the pin in through all the material. Then we will drill the second hole and pass the pin through, and then we'll drill the third hole. Following this process ensures that the handles all line up correctly. So the pin is now through both pieces of timber and the handle. I can support and drill the next hole. Second pin through all of the material locks the handle in. Now we can trace the handle, ready to remove the excess stock. At this point you can choose the front edge of what your handle will look like. I'm just going to go for a simple design. The teacher will now cut the excess off using the bandsaw. With the handle shape down as close to the line but leaving the line, we just need to smooth the front edge out. The front edge is sanded smooth prior to gluing because we can't get in there easily with the sandpaper. With the front edge sanded, we're going to run that over the buff wheel. This light buffing shows us what this timber is going to look like when it's polished up at the end. It's important to note that at this stage, lots of people like to completely finish their handles and then glue them on and then have minimal polish to do at the end. But I've found in a classroom setting that it's best off to do it this way and have the students finish the handle down to the blade. The next step is to dry fit the handle with 2 pins so that we can put a wax barrier at the front edge. The handles should go together fairly easily. It's tempting to hit these pins with the hammer, but I don't recommend that as they get bent and they also tend to dome over, which makes them hard to pull in and out of the handle. So we're going to apply some furniture wax along the front edge here where we don't want our glue to stick. But just using an old cotton bud, light coat of wax, and the front edge of the handle and that front edge of the blade. Later on when we go to finish the handle, the glue that's squeezed out onto these surfaces we will be able to pry off with a thin screwdriver. It's important to remember which sides of the scars we're applying the glue to. We're going to put them on the insides here. We're going to use super strength epoxy, which has a maximum bond time of 72 hours. By using this, you have a little bit longer setting time, 1 to 2 hours. So if you have any mistakes, you can pull the handle apart and have a play with it. In the past, we have used 5-minute arrow dot as well, if we know that it's going to work out. Taking a pin, we're going to ensure that there's plenty of glue down in the pinholes. Run that through. thin layer of glue. Make sure to cover all edges. So initially put the knife together with 2 pins. Then put the 3rd pin through. You can give this one a gentle tap. Once you have the handles fitted and the pins look fairly even, you can apply some clamps. I like these mini welding clamps, but you can also use trigger clamps in between the pins. I suggest leaving it to dry sitting upwards like that overnight. In the past, we've had students' pins fall through when they've been sat on their sides like that. So just leaving to set like that. You can wipe off any excess glue with a rag. Once the glue is set, we can remove the clamps. And we're going to shape down our handle. If you don't have a spindle sander, you can just use a file, and you can even use some sandpaper to get into those tight curves. With the handle edge profiled, it's now time to shape the handle down. Shaping the handle is personal preference, but I'm going to give you some starting points. Initially, I like to take the front edge down about 5 millimeters off each side. So I'll mark this. Essentially, something like this on each side. So I'll take this edge off here and give a wedge profile to the handle. Once I have this wedge profile, I'll run a 45-degree bevel around the whole side, and then I'll start to reduce the handle thickness until it feels comfortable to hold. This is where the personal preference comes in. When nearing the final shape, you need to go slow and not take too much handle material off, as you can't put it back on. You also need to remember that the next phase of sanding will actually reduce this handle even further. So if it feels a little bit big at the moment, that's okay. You can start to sand and see how it feels. Once again, we're working through the grids. When you finish sanding with 120, you should have your handle shaped and you should have no glue on the tang. Now it's time to move on to 240. Continue sanding with 240 until all the 120 sanding marks are removed. Moving on to 320 now. With the 320 grit sanding complete, the next stages depend on the type of finish you will use. If you have used micarta or G10 handles, you can keep polishing those materials up to 6, 8 and even 1200, and then you can buff them on the buff wheel. If you're using timber like this knife here, we really like this Osmo oil, and if you're using this, you would apply 2 coats, allowing overnight in between, and then finish off with steel wool. Today I'm going to use some furniture wax, which requires finishing up to 6 or 800 before application, then allowing 10 minutes for this to set and buffing on the buff wheel. Before applying the wax, I'm just going to check it over once more, look for any flaws, any parts that I might have missed the sanding. It's good to go. I'm going to remove the glue from the front edge of the knife. It should hopefully lift up easily, thanks to our application of wax early on. Now that the wax is dried, we can give it a buff. With the handle buffed and finished, we can now check the blade for any imperfections before sharpening. We can also take this opportunity to polish up to 1200 grit if you like. With the blade polished up to 1200, it's time to sharpen. You work your way along the sharpening machine from coarse to fine, slowly dragging the knife through, taking about 4 to 5 seconds on each side. I suggest doing about 10 passes on number 1 and then checking to see how it looks. We're looking for a nice even bevel forming on each side and consistency and thickness of the blade edge. Over time, what's called a wire will develop along this front edge, and it's where the metal comes up into a point and starts to almost break off. We work along these stones until that wire is almost gone, and then we knock the last bit off with a strop. Our strop is just a piece of old leather glued onto a stick. And there we have our complete sharpened knife ready for assessment and collection by a parent from the front office.